Good afternoon, everybody. It's the Close of Business Tuesday cast, and in an antidote to the US election, we are going to talk about Europe. Nothing but Europe. And it's going to be fantastic. Here's how we've thought about this. Back in early August, as you all know, BP made a big announcement about their strategy. And it's just increasingly clear that when it comes to the energy transition, nobody's more focused on it than Europe. So we're particularly excited to have Elvis Palumbi join us. Elvis is the Chief Investment Officer and Managing Partner at CF Partners. He's based in London. They do investments in energy and commodities and infrastructure. So Elvis is going to help us talk about that side of Europe. But more recently, the news out of Europe seems to have been, as it relates to the economy, the big news has been France and Germany and the UK implementing new lockdowns. And so we really wanted to understand what is going on in Europe or find someone who could help us understand the health situation there. And we have hit the absolute jackpot. We've got Dr. Paula Franklin with us. She's the Chief Medical Officer at Bupa. Bupa is the international health insurance and healthcare group that has 33 million customers worldwide. She's also in London. Bupa was originally founded in the UK. And so when it comes to financial health, we've got Elvis. And when it comes to all the other kinds of health, we've got Paula. So we're so lucky to have you guys. While you guys get ready to kick it around with us, Mike Bradley, we've had a lot of earnings going on. The oil markets have been up and down. Yesterday was a pretty green screen. I know the market's been up today. I'm stealing your thunder here, but Mike, tell us what's going on your screen.
Today, things are a little bit green, and if you noticed on Monday, things were pretty exciting in the energy markets. The crude oil had rebounded from a very low level over the weekend, and we're seeing some follow through today. And I think what that really boils down to is I think most people are getting a little bit concerned because there's short energy going into the elections. Polls are tightening, and they're basically unwinding some of those short trades. We're not seeing a lot of long only interest at this point in time. And the reason we're not seeing that is just because, the macro uncertainty is still going to be with us even a week from now, no matter who wins. And so, with the COVID lockdowns in Europe, with the Libya supply coming on right now, the global S&D right now is just not really good. We're going to have a decision with OPEC at the end of the month as to whether they roll over their quotas another 3 months. That seems like that's consensus. So to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about, why I think this is nothing more than a short-term rally and basically short covering is if you look at Q3, the short interest in the XOP, which is E&P related, and the XLE, they're up about 25 and 30% respectively. And if you look at some of the stocks that represent in the XOP, you've got some names like Marathon, where short interest is up 65%, Devon, where is up 55%, Diamondback up over 50%. And so if you see in the last couple of days, you've seen some of those stocks start to move because there is short covering. The question is are we going to have some follow through? And that's just going to depend on how the election results play out here. But bottom line, the market is short energy. We're seeing a short covering rally at this point in time, and we'll see what happens here in the next couple of days, depending on the election.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. So, Colin, I think you've done some homework setting the stage for our European jaunt this week. So let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. There are so many statistics floating around the internet about COVID. And I think many of us have gone to that Johns Hopkins website and seen the case study, the caseload and the mortality rate and all the rest of it. And it's just so important, as we've mentioned on this program before, to remember your statistical training and to remember that we're talking about different size countries and different situations. So we thought it'd be helpful just to move through that a little bit. It's not a happy subject, but we do have to talk about the fatality rate with COVID-19. And what we've done here is just plotted the daily death rate per million persons for 8 countries on a 10-day moving average basis. And 2 points jump out. You can see that there is a fairly large spike there in Belgium, of course, also in Spain and Italy. But notice that many of these European countries have gotten down to the 0 line in a way that the United States didn't. And so this is a way, we think people, particularly in the United States, don't often think about this because it's human nature to want to focus in on this spike. And it can be really important that this number over here on the US side did not get down to 0. And so while it's true that we have this second wave coming through, it's important to acknowledge that really the issue here is that by not tamping down the incidence of COVID in certain countries, that's what's allowing now this geometric progression for it to come back. And so Belgium, of course, with a very small population, really stands out on this chart. Germany, I think it's well known, has been more successful than other countries. But notice here that we have a clustering effect among these very wealthy countries in Europe and also including the United States. It's also human nature to not population adjust things and to kind of key in on the individual human experience. And that's what we're showing here on the right-hand side. This is actual persons per day, not compensating for the size of the country. And of course, you can see where policy is going to get very nervous seeing this 10-day moving average curve begin to move to the upside. When we look at the death rate per 100,000 population, and we look at the case fatality rate, not the infection fatality rate, but the reported incidence of death divided by the reported incidence of cases, 22 of the 40 countries with the highest confirmed death rate per that 100,000 are in Europe. So you can see why the entire world right now is increasingly training its attention toward the shutdowns that have been announced in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. And I should add that Massachusetts here in the States has also made a comparable announcement, which will take place on Friday. Of course, there's also this issue of if we look only at confirmed cases, we are completely ignoring all the asymptomatic cases. And so back to that Johns Hopkins website, which does many good things in informing the world, but just be careful that when it tells you there are 47 million confirmed cases globally and 9.3 million infections in the United States, we've got to sort of run the statistical analysis and acknowledge that the real numbers are going to be many multiples higher when we include those asymptomatic cases. No one knows for sure exactly what the numbers are, but the CDC and other well-respected representative bodies around the world have given estimates that it could be 10 times or even significantly higher than that. Now, turning to energy, liquids consumption by fraction does vary across the European countries, but also relative to the rest of the world. Notice that we have this very strong dependence on gas and diesel oils for both heating and transportation purposes. 4 economies, including the ones at the center of the announced lockdowns, account for 45% of Europe's 14.9 million barrels per day in total liquids consumption pre-COVID. So a pretty meaningful footprint. Germany, as I showed in the previous slides, is not really at the same kind of risk as the UK and France in terms of losing demand on the margin. So we're probably talking in the near term here about a 2 to 4 million barrel per day hit max on liquids demand. And then when we look across the pre-COVID numbers for Europe's primary energy demand by fuel back in 2019, we find that oil was 36% of demand, natural gas was 24%, nuclear and renewables were tied at about 10%. So, we're still looking at a continent that is very much tied to hydrocarbons. And so if we did see these lockdowns extend into the winter and into the spring, that could be a bad portent for the energy prices, particularly in oil and gas. To wrap up, where are we today? These are the year-to-date performances by equity index in local currency terms. You can see that Europe-wide, we have about an 11% decline in performance year-to-date. Russia really stands out as one of the weaker performers, down 33.7% in ruble terms. Of course, it's tied to oil. If you look at the right-hand side of this table, the ESPO cash price, that's the Eastern Siberian to Pacific Ocean cash price, down 44.8%. And across the petroleum liquids complex, whether we look upstream to the crudes, downstream to the products, we have 40 to 50% declines. Moving through Europe, we get eventually to the Scandinavian countries where we get some better performance, but really, still kind of lagging where we want to be. And then notice here in the US performances, we have the S&P 500 up year-to-date 2.46% intraday today. When we look at the Computer and Technology Index, the XCI, up 25.56. The XOI, as Mike was mentioning, the upstream oil-related indices, this one's down 53.87. So it's a story of large cap is beating small cap. Computers, technology, precious metals are beating upstream energy. You can see here the XAU is 35.3. Importantly, when we look at the bank indices, they too are down quite considerably, which perhaps helps explain why we see the lending banks behaving the way they are in certain transactions. And when we look across the commodities complex, the precious metals and the industrial metals really stand out as the one bright spot in what has been very much a downbeat story.
Well, that was fantastic. It's a stunning amount of information that shows you why the world is so complicated right now, having to look at all of that stuff. Paula, again, thank you for joining. And I would maybe one place to start is, particularly a lot of our viewers here in the U.S. Won't be as familiar with Bupa, but it's a huge organization. It's been around for, I guess, over 75 years now or so. Would you mind just telling our viewers a little bit about Bupa just to get started?
So Bupa focuses only on healthcare, and we have a range of businesses, some of which are involved in the funding of healthcare by insurance or other means, and others in the provision of healthcare. And the provision that we undertake ranges from acute tertiary hospital level care, right the way through primary care, outpatient care, but also into aged care of the elderly and residential homes, and ancillary health services like dental and optical and so on. Our largest areas of operation are in Australia and New Zealand, in Spain and Latin America, and also in the UK. And we have a number of businesses, a couple of businesses in Asia, and also in Saudi Arabia and India. So yeah, we're fairly spread about, but not much in the US, not American.
Well, this is Europe and non-US Day in general, so that fits in perfect. Paul, how would you describe your own year personally? I mean, this has been a year in the global health arena like a few others. How has your own year progressed? And you must have been pulled into so many things, so many discussions, so many debates. Just how do you replay 2020 so far?
It is a singular year, I think, for so many people. And for those of us involved in health, quite extraordinary, I think. For me, probably certainly a once in a lifetime situation. And I think incredibly pressured, regardless of where you are in the health system, whether you're right at the front line and looking after patients, or if you're involved in ensuring that those staff have the equipment and drugs and so on that they need. I think there's pressure throughout the whole chain there. And an interesting situation for many people working in healthcare, which is very often people are used to dealing with challenges to others, so threats to their patients, issues that they have to go and resolve for their patients. This is an environment where it's not just your patients that are at risk and suffering of concern, but we ourselves are at risk, our families are. And so there's never an opportunity, for example, to leave the hospital and go home and say, okay, I can forget about that overnight. There's no break from it. There's no relief from it. And I think that in many parts, not all, but in many parts of healthcare is not usual for people.
You know, I was thinking about, there's been an expression that's been used a lot, which is to listen to the science. That's an expression you hear quite a lot. And you know, we unfortunately in the US, we've politicized everything. So we can't even think straight anymore over here. But have you found that the science has been, have we learned a lot? Do you think we've made a lot of progress? Because I think part of the looking at the lockdowns in Europe makes everybody feel like, oh gosh, you know, maybe maybe we haven't learned as much as we thought we did, or maybe we're not doing as well, or maybe we're not progressing. Like, do you think the science has progressed on all this, or what's your feeling?
Yeah, I think the science has certainly progressed, and even sort of within these last 6 months, we know much more about the virus and how it behaves, how to treat it, how to protect people from it than we did, as I say, just a few months ago. I think the challenge in this situation is that this is not just an issue of healthcare. This is a healthcare caused problem, but actually the impacts are far wider. And I think one of the challenges which is the reason that we're seeing so many different approaches from governments across Europe and elsewhere, is the challenge is to balance the healthcare demands and needs and the protection of the population with the need to maintain an economy, a viable economy that allows people, when they are well, then to still have jobs, to still be able to work, to still be able to afford the healthcare again that they need in various countries. So it's that balancing act, I think, which is particularly challenging.
So maybe I can pull in our friend Elvis, because I think I was thinking, Paula, the healthcare stats and things that Colin was going through, those are dizzying. And there's so many jurisdictions and on different time scales and such. And Elvis, you're watching all this financial, meltdown / explosion to the upside. Like the way these markets have behaved, I don't think any of us would have predicted this. And I also don't think we were sitting here in March, we weren't thinking, I bet over this next 7 or 8 months, we talk about the energy transition more than we have in the previous 5 years. As an investor, how do you possibly keep track of all this? And because when you see these screens, it feels like you just want to take your money and stick it under the bed and don't do anything. But that's not a choice. What do you think?
Recognizing the backdrop that the unprecedented liquidity that central banks are injecting literally every day into the market, that's what's creating these erratic moves. I think what is fascinating to watch being an energy investor is the difference between fossil fuel driven names, including the super majors, and renewables. And as a business, we spend increasingly more time on the renewable side of things, and Europe stands out versus the States in that there is politically and from a societal perspective, there is much more a willingness to transition as fast as humanly possible without necessarily focusing on the fundamentals of what is going to take on that transition. But and Colin mentioned a lot of very interesting statistics in terms of the energy sources and the liquids consumption and the gas consumption and so forth. Like I said, there's a reality out there, and in the public markets, there is a choice that investors are making with their money when it comes to energy. They're taking money away from fossil fuel driven names and putting it in renewables and driving this incredible valuation divergence. One of the things that the virus has driven, the COVID-19 situation has driven, in particular when it comes to electricity generation, is that it has essentially accelerated the transition towards renewables. In the UK, we are in day 307 of 2020, and there has been in excess of a third of the days year to date in the UK where the UK has had no coal generation whatsoever, and coal constitutes roughly 25-30% of the baseload generation in the UK, because you've had a combination of lower electricity demand because of lower industrial activity and significantly higher renewable generation through wind and solar, where literally zero coal generation. So from a fundamental perspective, in an unusual demand year, we're seeing an acceleration towards renewables. We're also seeing the governments opening the fiscal taps to drive demand through very, very strong incentives towards consumers buying electric cars. For example, there are deals now on small electric cars in Europe, which cost as little as $9.99 a month to to lease an electric car, which is like the deals that you used to get for mobile phones. Now, granted, these are at the lower end of the market, and they are smaller cars, etc. And again, we're talking about tiny amounts of numbers when it comes to overall fleets and everything. But it's eye-catching kind of headlines, and it's that kind of a move that drives the flow of money.
Wow, there's a lot in there, Elvis. One thing about these lockdowns, how do you as an investor look at the lockdowns and how they could, because if I'm you, I'm not an investor, but you've got to look at lockdowns could come. That has an influence on a demand and activity. But then over the horizon, the money will at some point stop flowing from governments. And we will go back to work, and those coal plants will turn back on. So this what you're about to go through, how do you possibly pick an investment portfolio that's going to weather that? Or are you constantly having to change like every month?
No, we're not. I mean, we try and keep low exposure to the markets precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, Maynard, because otherwise you just go crazy having to change every day. So one has to take a view, and the view that we're taking is based on a combination of what we experienced in the first lockdown and what we're seeing now. And the reality is that even though we're experiencing lockdowns and there are more restrictions coming on from Thursday onwards in the UK than we had so far, it's not going to be nearly as severe as it was during the first time around. And there is another element to it, which is, regardless of what the government says in terms of what people should and shouldn't do, the amount of fear associated with the virus is significantly lower now, because as Paula mentioned earlier, the understanding about the virus is significantly higher. So the level of mobility, the level of people getting out and driving, etc., is going to be significantly higher, we feel now, than it was before. So in terms of demand, real demand hit, the number that Colin mentioned earlier, we don't think it's going to be nearly as severe as it was previously. And the recovery is going to be very strong. That's the other element of it. I mean, there's so much pent up demand in terms of people wanting to go out and travel and visit places, that people cannot wait for a solution to this situation to go out there and life going back to normal.
Elvis, if I could pick up on that that point, how do you think about the labor factor? Because we've seen the super majors and others announce layoffs of thousands and thousands of people. So if it's true that there's pent up demand and there is now a lack of supply, certainly a lack of capital and a lack of labor, and then we pull in Paula's world of mental health and the drumbeat of being told every single day that you're wrecking the planet. How do you think about what happens 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 18 months from now, when the 22-year-old coming out of university doesn't want to go work at an E&P company, or doesn't want to provide this gas and oil that's supposedly going to be here for decades to come, and we now have a major supply-demand imbalance?
Well, I mean, our view is that we're very constructive to commodity into the medium term, because we think that the virus the virus situation will normalize, and for all those reasons that you mentioned, Colin, not least the lack of investment from the super majors, but also recognizing the structural issue that they face in terms of hiring the best and the brightest going forward. We will eventually have a commodity shortage. Politically, Europe being a continent that is short commodity, other than a handful of countries, the move towards renewables is not accidental. It's entirely intentional, and so the hope is that these new forms of energy are going to fill that gap. And of course, that's unrealistic, given the start. I mean, the slides that you had showing the energy sources by consumption, make that point very well. We need to grow in terms of renewables very, very, very fast, which is not going to be possible in terms of substituting the fossil fuel generated energy. I think we're bullish commodity, but we're not bullish a lot of the equities, because the flow of money is not following the logic and the attractiveness of the underlying investments. It's following much more the politics here in Europe. And we all know as investors that you can be right on the fundamentals, but entirely wrong on the technicals, and you go out of business. So our bullishness is on the commodity and less so on the shares. I mean, and you can see the difference in the States. The majors, the Exxon, and in particular Chevron, has significantly outperformed the European majors this year by 10-15%. Now they're all negative, but there is serious outperformance on a relative basis there, and that tells you what the mindset is of European and European-based investors relative to U.S. investors that are still much more interested in looking at the fundamentals of these companies.
Hold that thought, Elvis. I want to circle back to that. Paula, I wanted to ask you lockdowns. In oil and gas, we have an expression, finding costs, which means how much does it cost to find a barrel of oil? Lockdowns, just as a layman, seem like the most expensive way to control. So the finding cost on eliminating disease seems really high to shut everything down. Could you help us understand the logic, maybe, if you would, that's going on in Europe right now? And Elvis mentioned these lockdowns may not be as severe as the other ones. Can you just help us understand the decision as best you can?
Sure. So we've seen various degrees of lockdown across Europe and also in Asia, and some also in Australia and New Zealand. We've experienced it there. The goal really is to reduce the rate of transmission of the virus. So the understanding is that we can't eliminate it at this point, and probably never will be able to. But to reduce the rate of transmission, to primarily, hopefully, protect those that are more vulnerable. So particularly focusing on the elderly, those with a lot of comorbidities, people with other conditions or other treatments that make them more vulnerable. But also to help health systems manage and cope with the influx of patients. And this is a major thing. So I don't think there's an illusion that by locking it down, you can eliminate the virus and bounce back to a normal economic situation and a normal healthcare situation. But it is around trying to reduce the pace, the acceleration of it, and therefore make it more manageable.
And is there, on that second point, because I think that's the point that so many people understand, is like we can't have everybody get sick at the same time because the system just can't handle it. You see so many countries in Bupa, and within the countries, there's different health systems and capacity and ability to expand capacity. Do you think it is a lockdown just it's almost a way of controlling supply and demand, and therefore the country's ability, if a country had an infinite capacity to have hospital beds, you wouldn't need a lockdown. I'm not even sure what I'm asking, Paula, but you must see different systems and different needs for lockdown type behavior.
Yeah, there have been lots of different approaches primarily imposed by governments across Europe. And it is about a supply and demand management situation, absolutely. So to lock people down and shut them away and try and prevent the spread of the virus sort of is going to make an impact there. The other side of it, of course, is to expand the provision. And we have seen that in some countries, and certainly in the UK, in Spain, the building of what we call field hospitals to expand the capacity, the building of new intensive treatment units has happened really in matters of weeks in order to expand the capacity to manage this. The other thing, of course, that's happening is, as I said before, we're finding our knowledge of how to manage the virus and people with the virus improving. And so that's also helping with reducing things like length of hospitalization and intensity of care that's needed. But it is exactly this balance. The other thing is, though, that these decisions around amount of provision and locking people down aren't made out in a vacuum. They're made in the context of the political, economic, social and cultural environment of the country. And these are very different. And we're certainly seeing that even from the point of view, for example, of the behavior of the general public. You know, is it a society that are generally rule followers and will do as they're told? And on the whole, we see that more in certain Scandinavian countries. They tend to be more happy to follow the rules. In some other countries, less so. And that's also part of the government's understanding and decision about what type of lockdown should we create. The final thing I'll say, though, is that some of the aspects of the lockdowns that we've had in various of our countries do not always, to me, seem to have made much sense, quite frankly. I think we are sometimes made short-term or decisions with a short-term view rather than playing it out and understanding what the long-term consequences of them might be.
If I could pick up on that point, we have this issue of kind of a deferred medical treatment as one of the costs that we might put on the table, and then also new problems that occur because of the lockdown. One statistic that really jarred me earlier this year was when the WHO's Director General talked about the foregone vaccinations for smallpox and polio, and the number was crazy. It was like 80 million doses or something like that. Could you just help us understand better some of the consequences of some of these lockdowns on those critical, like important for the rest of your life kind of decisions?
Well, we're seeing them already. So we have absolutely, since actually quite early in the sort of pandemic stage, I guess, and varying different lockdown situations, but we've seen very early on people being reluctant to access healthcare. So I'm talking about people that don't have COVID, that have other conditions. And because of the diversion of healthcare provision towards those who are infected with the virus, then routine treatments aren't happening. And some of those routine treatments are really important for maintenance of long-term conditions, for certain surgeries, certain therapies, and so on. And the consequence of that, of course, is that when someone finally comes to get their treatment, they're in a more advanced stage. And so it's not as easy to treat as it was originally, but it's also more costly. It's more expensive to treat. You need greater intervention at that point. That is absolutely clear. And that is happening all across Europe. And we're very clear about that. And so trying to balance within a healthcare provision situation, the treatment of the acute illness with the maintenance of the ongoing non-acute, non-urgent care is absolutely critical. There's another confounding factor in that, though, which is the information that we are now seeing, and increasingly we're getting studies coming through on this, which is the long-term effects of the COVID infection itself. And so that's going to add again into a healthcare burden. And we know for the nature of the virus, it's an inflammatory virus. And we know, for example, that people are getting long-term respiratory problems, long-term cardiac problems. In some cases, we've certainly seen long-term liver problems and acute kidney issues, which we are expecting may also at some point result in those. So COVID is not only going to cause this acute healthcare issue, but it's actually going to cause long-term healthcare issues too.
That's something that you just don't hear talked about as much. Maybe one thing, Paula, and then Elvis, you can answer this question from your view too. This COVID and everything that has come with it, the economic impact, et cetera, has resulted in us having a higher level of government involvement in all aspects of life than, it's gone up 500%. And we all understand why that happened, but you do kind of wonder, are we going to be able to dial that back, and should we dial that back? And this sort of gets a little, I don't mean to get political, but I do mean to ask you, are you surprised at the level of government involvement? Are you surprised at the various governments' willingness to really lean into this and to try to govern things that you thought were ungovernable? You know, for instance, I swear I think Dr. Fauci said something about whether or not we should have Thanksgiving gatherings. And anyway, I'm just curious, what do you make of where we are with government involvement, and are we going to be able to heal from that?
That's a really good question. I'm not really surprised about the level of government involvement, because what we have is a public health crisis. And I think the nature of healthcare in most countries is that it's fragmented to a greater or lesser degree. And therefore, none of the players really have a countrywide public health perspective in the same way that a government does. So I'm not surprised at their willingness to get involved. I think that from a healthcare perspective, I think that their retreat, once we get a bit further through this, is essential. And hopefully, in some degrees, I think they will see that it is inevitable, because increasingly the way that healthcare is consumed and the way in which we need it to be provided, and I'm talking now about moving from the old medical model of everybody has to visit and see face-to-face with a doctor, with a nurse. So, you know, we're in a much more dynamic healthcare environment now. That's never going to thrive, I personally, it's my personal view, in a completely government-dominated situation. You need many players in the market, and you need competition in the market, I think, to make that maximally effective.
So you think things like telemedicine and I don't know, cheaper, more competitive dynamics may creep in significantly after all this?
They already have. So the virus so far has accelerated the use of digital healthcare. I want to use a better term, more dramatically than anything in many, many years. We've seen it and watched it coming, creeping along for years. And in a matter of months, we've moved more than we have maybe in the last 10 years. And I don't think we're going to wind that back at all. I think that's an inevitable part of the future of healthcare.
Do you think somewhere in here we've said that their health, we've kind of moved philosophically to the government is responsible for people's health, as opposed to the government is responsible for telling people what they need to know, but it is ultimately their responsibility? Have we made a philosophical change in here? We used to just put the warning pack on the cigarette and tell them, you know, that's your, I don't know if I'm asking a libertarian question or what I'm asking here, Paula, but did we change our views on who's responsible for what somewhere in all of this?
I don't think so. I think that what we're seeing is an emergency response to an acute crisis. I think that certainly at the beginning of the outbreak, and you can see this if you look at the way that different governments behaved across Europe, it was very much around providing information and expecting and hoping personal accountability. And I think it became clear reasonably early, certainly in places like Spain and Italy reasonably early, that actually that wasn't going to work. And it's slightly different than other healthcare situations, which is that my behavior doesn't only impact me, and it doesn't only impact those people that are close to me, that are, you know, within my own household or whatever. So I think the need to help people understand, and if necessary enforce to some degree, which is what a lockdown is really, the behavior that's going to help people protect others and to some degree protect themselves. But that's not going to be sustainable in my personal view.
So Elvis, the growth in government, what's your take? Is this
I completely understand the questions you're asking, and I think that with the best intent, I think we've crossed quite a few lines in terms of individual liberties and decision making. Historically, it's and from a society perspective, it's more acceptable to accept a higher level of government intervention in Europe than it is in the States. But even here, I mean, the level of interventionism is very high. You know, with good reasons, as Paula pointed out, this is an unprecedented situation. It's difficult to see how we pull back though from these levels of intervention. And so I think I recognize a lot of the positives in terms of making things more efficient in terms of telemedicine, and working from home has become much more efficient for a lot of people, and things of that nature. I recognize a lot of that. There's a shift in terms of the employment type in the economy as a result of the crisis. But at the end of it, we're still going to be left with a much bigger government than we had before we started, and with a bigger bill to pay at the end of it.
Yeah, let's touch that one if you don't mind. Colin, what's the number? You had this number, a rough approximation. What governments have borrowed globally to fund all of these various things?
One statistic that we often point out is the quantity of sovereign debt that is priced to deliver the beauty of a negative yield to the person who owns the paper. And that is now a $16 trillion bogey in US dollars. That is in addition to the 13 trillion that has come out of various parts of the United States government, including the expansion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And then put on the other, that's the capital, put on the other side the labor that Elvis is talking about, and you have officially 13 million unemployed Americans, and then an additional 13 million who are off the rolls. So if you think of it from the classic, factor input perspective, you now have like this unbelievably skyrocketing amount of money, which will produce inflation down the road, and arguably already is, and silver and gold, as we've talked about before. And this labor that is sitting there now on the side wondering, am I going to go work for a different refinery or a different company, or am I about to become a solar worker, or do I need to go and help Paula set up a system to do medicine in the next spot that they move into? It's a very difficult kind of moment.
Okay, so I'll go with your 29 trillion. This is the other thing. As a global society, it happens everywhere. We think no one has to pay this back, or there's somehow no consequences. Are you worried about that, Elvis, as an investor, whether it's inflation or the ability to keep funding this stuff, or just systemic problems?
We've had this concern for a while, even before this crisis. The amount of largesse from central banks has been an issue for since the financial crisis, and this is another crisis that requires exceptional measures. And we're now in a territory where the governments and central banks can't afford for interest rates to go up because the interest bill is so big. The fundamental issue with that is that they can control the yield curve by going and buying all the debt that the government issues, but central banks doing that. We've seen that movie being played out for a long time here in Europe. It creates these artificial markets where risk is mispriced. I think an additional concern that stems from this latest amount of spending is that eventually taxes will have to go up because these bills have to be paid. And I've seen a lot of pieces of work around this, and the concern is that we're responding as a society to this crisis by borrowing heavily and passing the burden to the younger generation, having to pay back this bill, and it's something that's going to drag on growth for years to come. It is a real concern. It is something that we focus on.
We're getting to the end of the time. You guys have been so generous to join us and to share your thoughts. Let me try to ask each of you as we wrap up. Paula, do you think 6, 12, 18 months from now, are you feeling optimistic? Are we going to get through this? Is this the the dark before it gets light again? Like, what's your own prognosis for us?
We will certainly get through this. Absolutely, it's going to take a while. We haven't talked about vaccines, but that's not a quick and easy solution. So it's going to take us a long time. We're going to be paying for it, as we've just heard, I think, for generations. And I think we need to keep our eyes very wide open, because this is not a unique situation and this can happen again.
Have we learned a ton, and if it happens again in 10 years, we'll be stone cold good at it, or will we replay this tape?
I'm very hopeful that we will have learned. Throughout this, I've been saying I can't wait for all of the papers that are going to be written in business schools and public health schools across the world about, retrospectively about what we did wrong and how we could do better. The little sort of sneaky concern I have in all of this, of course, is the politics, because there's a lot of government involvement, as we talked about, and government decision making that impacts this, and the politics can be very unpredictable.
Well, Elvis, as you answer, can you throw in one more part of it, which is, the energy transition is not cheap, and we've already borrowed quite a lot. So you could make a case that somewhere in here, we're going to say, wait a minute, we've got to think about the cost of all this stuff. Or you could make the case that that's just not where the world is headed. And so as you think about the next 6, 12, 18 months, try to tackle all of Paula's questions. Are we going to get through it? But also throw in 18 months from now, are we going to still have huge renewable values, low fossil fuel values, and be in the same mindset that we're in right now?
That's exactly where we're heading. I think that the amount of money that the EU, but also the UK government, is about to earmark to fund this energy transition is, in the grand scheme of things, a drop in the bucket. It does create jobs. Question is, the hope is that these jobs that it creates, these sectors, these industries that it is aiming to support, the hope is that they're going to follow in the footsteps of solar and onshore wind and become competitive in the medium term. But in the short term, there is very little that stands in the way of that move. The reality is that over the next 12 to 18 months, we will continue to see a lot higher the rise of the renewables continue, because you have a lot of money. Forgetting about the fundamentals, you have a lot of money going into the space and very few names that are investable. One of the big discussions that we're having with the European majors right now is around the fact that they are investing a lot in the renewable space and getting no credit for it. So at some point in time, they will look across to the companies that have split their businesses and they're getting incredible valuation for renewables. Non-existent businesses was getting slammed for their fossil fuel businesses, and they will split themselves. So yes, I think that's exactly what's going to happen.
But one thing we were talking about here, that the shale revolution was an overcapitalized revolution that ultimately the investors said, okay, I'm not having as much fun anymore, I need a return. Don't you think that's going to happen in the renewable space? I mean, it may be 5, 7, 9 years from now, but eventually the money's going to say, hey.
There are business models that will definitely go that way. I mean, I'm personally very skeptical about, green hydrogen, for example, especially as we sit here today. There's a lot of enthusiasm around that. But on the flip side, there are some very interesting business models that have emerged, in particular when it comes to solar, and not solar everywhere, but solar in places that have sun, for example. So I think there are some good businesses, and there are many bad businesses. It's the difference with the shale revolution in the States is that a lot of this is government funded and government subsidized with negative interest rate money that no one has to pay for, Maynard.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if I feel better or worse, but it's an important distinction. Well, look, you guys have been fantastic. Paula, all of us have been wanting to have a chance to talk to someone like you and get our own questions answered. So we can't thank you enough. And Elvis, your job of looking at the screen every day and trying to figure out how to manage money, it's pretty darn hard. You're both good friends at TPH, and we just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and all the best to you.